The priest had no idea he was being filmed. What he did next shocked everyone. In the picturesque village of Saint Michel, where cobbled streets wound between houses with stone walls whitened by time, Father Antoine was much more than a simple priest. He was not only the spiritual guide of the inhabitants, but he was also the soul of the community. For almost 3 decades, he had held his role with exemplary devotion, embodying both wisdom and simplicity. The villagers admired him, not only for his deep piety, but also for his unique ability to understand human suffering. It was said that the most intimate secrets of souls were revealed to him as if by magic, that he had a special gift for offering advice that brought an inexplicable form of peace. He was not a priest like the others. He was not a man of rigid ceremonies, but rather a humble guide, always ready to lend an ear and provide words of consolation or wisdom to lost souls. His sermons were imbued with a gentleness which contrasted with the often severe dogmas of the great cities. But beyond his words, it was his look, a penetrating, almost supernatural look, as if he always knew what was going on in the hearts of his parishioners. Many said his advice was like a light in the darkness, a beacon for those battling their inner demons. In difficult times, his words had the power to comfort, calm fears, and bring a new perspective to the most desperate problems. He lived modestly, true to his wishes, in the old rectory house which stood at the end of the main street. The building, although aging, was a haven of tranquility. It almost blended into the natural setting of the village, surrounded by large oak trees and thick bushes which sheltered a simple, but well-kept garden. The slate roof, worn by the years, was covered in moss, and the windows of the house let out a soft light at each dusk, a reminder that peace lay in simplicity. His days were punctuated by morning masses, the confessions of souls in pain, and the spiritual advice that he provided tirelessly. He seemed to never tire, always available for his loved ones, always calm, always caring. When evening came, however, Father Antoine often disappeared into the sacristy. There, in solitude and the shadow of the candles, he devoted himself to prayer and meditation, sometimes for hours, seeking answers to his own inner torments. Some said he was a man who carried within him infinite wisdom, but who, deep down, hid a heavy burden. All the inhabitants of the village adored him. He was the one who unified souls, who instilled peace and faith, the one whose mere presence seemed to ward off the darkness of daily existence. But no one really knew what he was going through behind the closed doors of the presbytery. Everything seemed perfectly ordered in his life. However, everything would change one sunny spring afternoon. Martin, a young man of 24, never planned to end up in Saint Michel. Life had taken him away in a spiral of loss and mourning. He had recently lost his mother in a tragic car accident, and since then he had felt like a ship adrift, lost in an ocean of uncertainty and sadness. After months of wandering in search of meaning, he went to Saint Michel, attracted by the reputation of this quiet village and its priest, Father Antoine, who seemed to embody all the values he had once ignored. Martin had attended several masses over the past few weeks, and each time he listened to Father Antoine speak, he felt a strange form of serenity settle over him. This priest had this unique way of speaking to the soul, of finding the right words to soothe torment. With each encounter, he had the impression that there was something special about this man, an aura of mystery, an ancient wisdom that seemed to captivate him. Father Antoine was not content with offering ready-made answers. He suggested that certain truths had to be discovered oneself, with patience and dedication. One day, Martin, moved by an emotion that he was unable to understand, decided to stay after Mass to speak to the priest. Perhaps he needed to confide his pain to her, or perhaps he simply hoped to understand the basis of the serenity that emanated from him. He timidly approached Father Antoine, whose still calm gaze seemed to perceive his deepest thoughts. Their exchanges were gentle but deep. Martin told the man of faith about the loss of his mother, his inability to find inner peace, and his quest to understand a greater meaning in his suffering. Father Antoine listened to him attentively, assuring him that everything was a question of faith, but also of understanding oneself. His words, although comforting, nevertheless left a feeling of unfinished business in Martin. What he was looking for was not just in religion, but in something more complex, more unfathomable. When the conversation ended, Father Antoine went to the sacristy to put away the liturgical objects. Martin felt drawn by an invisible force, a curiosity that never left him. He knew that the priest was a private man, a man of faith, but something inside him told him that this man carried a secret he had never shared with anyone. Martin decided to follow him discreetly, without knowing what he might discover. His mind was filled with questions, and an insidious intuition whispered to him that behind this facade of piety, there was perhaps something much more complex. In the sacristy, Father Antoine seemed at ease in his familiar surroundings, arranging sacred objects and murmuring prayers as he always did. But this time, Martin couldn't take his eyes off him. He slipped silently inside, placing his cell phone under the altar table, activating the camera without the priest noticing. He knew that he was going to observe something intimate, something that eluded the understanding of the ordinary man, but he did not yet know to what extent what he was going to discover would disrupt his own existence and that of the entire village. What he didn't know then was that this simple gesture of curiosity would become the catalyst for a shocking revelation, a revelation that would shatter the perfect image of Father Antoine and transform the community of Saint Michel forever. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Father Antoine, as he did every evening, put away the sacred objects with almost solemn slowness. His gestures were usual. He wiped the altar, folded the tablecloths, and murmured prayers in an ancient and familiar language. The light of the candles danced on the walls, casting moving shadows that gave a feeling of calm, as if the sacristy itself was breathing to the rhythm of the priest's prayer. The latter's habits seemed benign, almost ritualistic, and to Martin it was a simple continuation of what he had observed during the last days in this church. But soon, something disturbing happened. Father Antoine approached a small wooden chest, barely visible under a worn, carefully folded tablecloth. Martin had seen this chest several times, but he had never paid particular attention to its presence. The priest opened the chest carefully, as if he were taking out something very precious. Inside, an ancient parchment was carefully rolled up, its rough texture and smell of old paper harkening back to times immemorial. The priest slowly unfolded the parchment, and that's when Martin saw something he never imagined. Letters in a language he didn't understand, intertwined with occult and esoteric symbols. In the center of the parchment, a strange symbol was traced with disturbing precision. A closed circle, crossed by intertwined lines, forming complex angles and curves.
Martin, wide-eyed, watched in silence.
Father Antoine did not seem to be disturbed by her presence, or he simply did not realize it. The priest then murmured words in a language that seemed to slip out of the world, a language that in no way resembled those he had taught during his homilies. It was an ancient, almost guttural language, which he spoke with such intensity that it seemed to vibrate in the air around him. Then, for the first time, Martin saw a physical change in the priest. Father Antoine, usually so calm and serene, seemed to enter a trance state. His hands trembled slightly, as if pulled by an invisible force. His face contorted in intense concentration, his eyes closed, and his breathing became deeper, almost frightening.
The black candle on the altar lit suddenly, casting a strange, incandescent light, contrasting with the softer glow of the usual candles.
Martin, frozen, realized that he could no longer look away. He was caught in a whirlwind, hypnotized by this scene that he did not understand. The priest then traced symbols in the air with a pentagram-shaped gemstone, his fingers moving slowly but with supernatural precision. The light of the black candle trembled under the movements of his hands, and an invisible force seemed to manifest in the air, heavy and palpable. The religious chants that Father Antoine had recited earlier mingled with deeper, more guttural murmurs, as if he were speaking to invisible entities. A strange wind suddenly rose in the room, although all the windows were closed. The curtains fluttered slightly, as if caught by a breeze coming from nowhere. This wind, gentle but icy, seemed to envelop the sacristy in a strange atmosphere, as if another world was making its way through reality. Martin felt cold sweat beading on his forehead, but he didn't dare move, gripped by terror and disbelief. What he saw was more than just a ritual. It was an invocation, an act of a nature he could not understand or explain. The priest's whispers became louder, more intense, resounding like incantations. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The wind disappeared, the candlelight stabilized, and Father Antoine slowly calmed down. He opened his eyes, the trance dissipating like a cloud, giving way to normalcy. His hands were still trembling slightly, but his face had returned to calm, almost peaceful. He put his cassock back on with strange gentleness, slowly closing the chest containing the parchment and occult symbolism he had handled. Without looking at the place where he had just performed his strange ritual, he covered the altar with a cloth and headed for the door, oblivious to the fact that he had just left behind damning evidence of what he had done. Martin waited a few seconds, his heart racing. Then, agitated and stunned, he rushed out of the sacristy, looking for a way to digest what he had just experienced. He rushed to his phone, shaking, and watched the video he had filmed. What he had just recorded was irrefutable proof, but also testimony to a frightening and deep secret. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if what he was doing was right, but the conviction that this secret needed to be brought into the public light prevailed. He posted the video on social media. The reaction was not long in coming. In less than an hour, the video went viral. Comments poured in, villagers shocked, horrified, some even incredulous, unable to believe that the man they had worshipped for years was involved in occult practices. Others refused to admit the truth, some seeking excuses, rational explanations for what they had seen. But the truth was there, irrefutable, within everyone's reach.
The news spread like wildfire across Saint-Michel.
The village, once peaceful, found itself shaken by rumors and accusations. The inhabitants, who had always venerated Father Antoine, began to doubt. Was this priest whom they considered a man of faith, a spiritual guide, really what he appeared to be? The respect they had for him turned into distrust. The whispers spread, turning into increasingly heated rumors, until hundreds of people gathered outside the church, demanding answers. Father Antoine, still unaware of the extent of the situation, tried to continue his activities as if nothing had happened. The next morning, he entered the church, ready to celebrate Mass, but upon his arrival he was greeted by a group of angry parishioners. The accusing looks, the murmurs filled with anger and confusion destabilized the priest. The words that came next were the cruelest. "Explain to us what we saw. Why did you betray our faith?" Father Antoine, whose world was collapsing around him, found himself in a position he had never envisaged. In the spotlight, accused of spiritual corruption and betrayal. The foundations of the faith he had spent his entire life defending were beginning to crack, and he knew he could never go back. Father Antoine, cornered and trapped by revelations that he could no longer ignore, agreed to appear before the community to explain his actions. The church was packed, the lined pews were occupied by nervous parishioners, their murmurs creating a heavy atmosphere. He walked slowly towards the altar, visibly weighed down by the weight of his years of secrecy. His gaze wandered for a moment on the wooden crucifix behind him, as if searching for an answer in the eyes of Christ. Then he turned to the assembly, his face marked by years of inner struggle. "My dear brothers and sisters," he began in a weak but resolute voice, "it is time for you to know the truth." Everyone's eyes were glued to him, waiting for an explanation. But his words, far from being those they imagined, shocked the entire village. He spoke of an ancient lineage, of a family carrying forbidden knowledge, heir to occult traditions passed down from generation to generation. These practices, he said, did not concern black magic or the forces of evil, but were rites of purification, intended to awaken the human soul to deep and invisible truths. He explained how he grew up watching his father and grandfather, respected men in their fields, perform these rituals in the privacy of their homes, far from the eyes of the world. "I have always served God with all my heart," he continued. "But this knowledge, what was passed on to me, does not simply fade away. I fought against it, repressed it for many years, but I also understood that certain things, certain truths, cannot be ignored. These practices allowed me to understand human nature, to see beyond the material world." The silence became heavy. The priest's words seemed to echo within the walls of the church, as if the air itself had stopped circulating. Some in the audience looked at each other in disbelief, others looked away, unable to bear the revelation of the one they considered to be a man of pure faith. Cries of confusion, murmurs of incomprehension invaded the room. Father Antoine raised a hand, as if to calm the storm that was beginning to arise. He continued in a firmer tone, as if he wanted to update everything, reveal everything. I never wanted to hurt anyone. My rituals were not an attempt to subdue occult forces, but rather a personal quest to better understand the world and its mysteries. I believed that by practicing these rites in silence, away from prying eyes, I could avoid scandal and the disapproval of the church and the world. But I see now that this silence has only fueled distrust and suspicion. At that moment, a shudder ran through the room. The priest's words, far from soothing souls, seemed like a veil being torn, exposing a raw and uncomfortable truth. Father Antoine, in his confession, had broken the last barrier between the reality perceived by his parishioners and the invisible which surrounded them. The priest stopped for a moment, his eyes dull, as if a part of himself had just died in the middle of confession. He added in a softer, almost desperate voice, I didn't want to betray your faith in me. But by doing so, by remaining silent, I betrayed my own faith, the faith in the truth. And for that, I am deeply sorry. The impact of his words tore the community apart. Many were in shock, unable to accept the idea that a man they had considered a spiritual figure could have hidden such a truth. Tears flowed among the older ones, those who had grown up listening to his preaching and venerating him as the moral guide of the village. Others, younger, seemed dejected, unable to understand why such a cover-up had been deemed necessary. But what surprised Father Antoine the most was the shared reaction within the crowd. On the one hand, a few voices were raised, not to condemn, but to offer support. They said he had acted out of ignorance, or even out of a sincere desire to understand greater truths than the Church was willing to reveal. For them, Father Antoine's spiritual quest was only a sincere search for truth, perhaps misdirected, but ultimately human. On the other hand, some proclaimed their betrayal, accusing the priest of soiling the true faith and of perverting the trust they had placed in him. They considered his actions unforgivable, a challenge to the very essence of the religion he represented. Minds were divided. Those who had once found peace in the priest's words now found themselves doubting everything they had thought they knew. A few weeks later, the Church, under pressure, made the decision to remove Father Antoine from his functions. He was exiled, leaving behind a village devastated by his revelations. Some rejected him outright, but others, more understanding, sought to see in him a man who, despite his faults, had sought to understand the mysteries of existence that many still had to face. The village of Saint Michel, once harmonious and united, fractured into two camps. The division ran deep, and the scars left by Father Antoine's confession would never completely heal. The inhabitants continued to live their lives, but now with a more suspicious, more disillusioned outlook. The priest, for his part, was fleeing his past, taking refuge in unknown lands, seeking an interior exile as deep as that imposed by the community. Martin, for his part, still lived with the echoes of this discovery. His own beliefs were tested, and he found himself questioning everything he had thought he knew about faith, about humanity, and about himself. Although the eyes and judgments of others were now behind him, he realized that his own spiritual path would never be the same again. He wondered, in the silences of his lonely nights, where the truth truly lay.